The Experiment by Becca Lewis. Copyright 2019. Audio by Becca Lewis. Copyright 2020. Author notes. Although The Experiment stands alone as a short story, it also fills in a few gaps from 3 of my book series. The first, The Karass Chronicles, is set on the planet Gaia. Gaia is the world that you and I know best, but I call it the Earth Dimension in the Karass series. The second series, The Return to Erda, follows a few of the characters found in the Karass Chronicles to another dimension on Gaia. Yes, there are other dimensions, and amazingly, scientists are trying to build portals to find them. In fantasy, we have already done that. The third series, The Chronicles of Thamon, takes place on another planet, but all 3 are set into a universe that I am creating. This means that although you may meet a whole new set of characters, there will also be familiar characters from the first 2 series that end up on Thamon. So even though I hope this short story satisfies you on its own, I'm also hoping that I have aroused your curiosity and you will find your way to the world and books that this short story introduces. If you are ready, we can begin. Chapter 1. The brothers surveyed the land and nodded in approval. Both brothers were long and lean, one fair, one dark. Although they had traveled across thousands of years and through countless universes, there were no traces of that on their faces. This might be one of the most beautiful planets that we have seen so far, Brother One said. Without waiting for his brother's response, One spread out his long arms, leaned back into the tall grasses, and breathed in the air sweetened by the wild flowers growing in the meadow. The brothers had circled the planet for a few weeks before choosing this place to land. They had seen the broad swaths of forests and the massive expansion of crystal blue oceans. They had skimmed over mountains, watching the animals scatter below, and the pines sway in the wind. They had hovered over the massive icebergs that covered much of the land, and finally chosen this spot to set their craft down. Their long legs had stepped out onto many planets, but this was the first one that had made them pause this long to marvel in its beauty. Planets didn't have to be beautiful for the brothers to choose them for their experiments. Each world only had to have basic necessities for supporting the life forms they would bring to seed it. Some beings would survive, and some would not. That was part of the fun, part of the test. A planet that would support the 2 of them, now that was rare. In fact, in all the time the 2 brothers had been traveling, they had only found 3 others, but none as beautiful as this one, or a planet that reminded them so much of home. Their home planet had been destroyed thousands of years before. Those that had the resources managed to leave before its destruction. The brothers were 2 of those lucky few. Among the survivors, a council was elected to have the final say in what impact they would have on the universe as they traveled to new worlds. But that had been thousands of years before, and the brothers had been on their own ever since. At first it had been fun, an adventure. Then the brothers got bored, so they came up with ways to amuse themselves. It wasn't easy. However, they managed to find a few things that entertained them. Eventually, they found the game they liked the best: play with the evolution of the planets they found. The game involved adding a variable to the planet that wasn't there before. The problem was, you can only do that kind of thing for so long before boredom sets in again. There was only so much the brothers could do to mess with things. So it seemed to Brother One that their landing on this planet was a chance to do something else. Because of all the worlds they had seen, this was the first one that reminded them of home. It was almost as if they had circled back through time to find it. Both of the brothers were aware that the possibility existed, but it didn't matter. In the end, The planet they knew of as home had been destroyed. This planet was new. Perhaps millions of years would pass before it would face destruction. "It's so beautiful here," Two whispered. "Aren't you tired of traveling? We've seen everything. Why not stay? It reminds me of home." One let out an uncharacteristic sigh. Even at one's most bored, he had contained himself. One thought it was his duty, because he was the older of the two of them, soldier on, find a reason for continuing. He was the one who had come up with the idea of testing things for fun, for sport, and to give their superior intellect something to focus upon. Otherwise, they might have gone mad, just the two of them. One thought the tests were an elegant solution. Besides their experiments on planets, they also picked up samples of other species and did tests with them too. Sometimes it was physical testing, but over the years, they had discovered that psychological tests were more fun for them. That's when they had the idea that they had been experimenting with for the past 1,000 years or so. Now, they were both bored with that game too. Perhaps on this planet the brothers could find some contentment, maybe even experience joy, something they had lost the moment their world disappeared through the window of their spaceship. Instead of experimenting, one asked, "Yes, perhaps we could be the experiment instead." One shook his head. "No. What about all the other planets we have run tests on? Don't you want to see what became of them? What is the point of it if we don't go back and look?" Two plopped down on a nearby stone. "But this one is so beautiful. I'm tired. Can't we just let it be?" One looked fondly at his younger brother, at least as fondly as one could look at a brother he had been traveling with for thousands of years. Two was right. What did all those trips through the countless galaxies mean when they were still bored? Perhaps staying on this planet would change all that. Still, Brother One's researcher's mind could not let it go. They had data to collect. "What about this?" Brother One said. "We'll go back and check on what we've done. Then we'll return here, and if our experiments haven't destroyed this planet, we'll stay." Brother Two sat up from where he was lying in the meadow to see if his brother was telling the truth. "You agree to this?" Two asked. One nodded and put his hand over his heart to seal his promise. "Let's hope that it's still here when we come back. But first, we have an experiment to begin. Shall we bring the test subjects down? Enough for 2 dimensions? Or do you want to do more?" Two sighed again and hoped against hope that the sky would be this blue the next time they came by. Maybe if they only experimented with 2 dimensions, it would remain this beautiful in at least one of them. Or there might be another dimension on this planet that would stay pristine if they didn't experiment with it. 2 dimensions. That's enough. "Done," One answered. Brother One reached down and helped his brother to stand. Together they gazed out over the meadow and the forest beyond. This would be the last time they would be the only 2 beings on the planet. "What shall we call this one? I'm tired of just numbering them." "So you don't want to make this planet 999? One laughed. "I'm serious, One. Why don't we call it what we called our home planet? It's gone now. No one will know but us." "Gaia, it is," One answered. He agreed with his brother. This planet might make a beautiful home for the 2 of them. Maybe they should add something into what they were doing that would make it more likely that at least one of the 2 dimensions would survive. If so, what would it be? Chapter 2. Many, many thousands of years later. Suzanne watched her Earth Father Earl writing at his desk, preparing for their last meeting. Their mission was over. At least it was for everyone else. She had more to do. In her heart, Suzanne knew that she would always have more to do, and there might never be a place that would be a forever home for her. The team that would be taking over would be arriving soon. It had taken many years to pull the new group together, and now that they were ready, Suzanne's team in the Earth dimension could move on. Helping her prepare for the meeting was her best friend in Earth, Abigail. Abigail had come to stay in the house with Suzanne and Earl years before, after her husband Tom had died. Well, not died in the traditional sense. Tom had chosen instead to join the other members of the Forest Circle who lived outside of this Earth dimension. Suzanne wondered if she would ever have a husband in the way other people did. She didn't think so. It would take an extraordinary person to be able to deal with what she was, not just human. Something else which would never fit in the Earth realm. It barely fit in the Erda realm, her home dimension. The other members of the Forest Circle had managed to maintain a life in the Earth dimension that looked like everyone else's who lived here. Perhaps it was because they had stayed here, while she was always traveling between the Earth and Erda dimensions. Suzanne shook those thoughts off. It was the least of her worries. Too much needed to be taken care of before Earl and Ariel could leave the Earth realm and return to Erda as themselves. Although Earl and Ariel were her parents in the Earth realm, they were not her parents in the Erda dimension. Still, she called them Mom and Dad in both dimensions because she loved them as if they were. The rest of her Forest Circle team was waiting for the three of them to join them. They had named themselves the Forest Circle for two reasons. The obvious one was because they lived surrounded by forests in the northwestern part of what Earth people called the United States. But there was another reason. Erda, the dimension that Suzanne, Earl, and Ariel had come from, overflowed with forests. It was the trees that supplied everything needed for life in that dimension. They did here too, but it wasn't quite the same. The Earth realm was too practical, or impractical, depending on whom you asked. The people of Earth worked so hard to make a living, they often forgot to live. In spite of that, Suzanne loved the people of Earth, and in spite of how difficult it was for her to live in two places, she wouldn't trade it for anything. But times were changing. Even though the Earth dimension was having problems that she would like to help with, there was an immediate problem that needed her attention in Erda. They needed to return to Erda as soon as possible. But before they did, they had to gather the next team and help the members remember that they were more than what they believed themselves to be. Earth people often forgot things. In some ways, it was better that way. In other ways, not so much. Their forgetfulness was causing disasters throughout the Earth realm. Greed and lack of empathy had taken over many of the prominent rulers in the Earth dimension. Whether this dimension survived would largely depend on what this new group could accomplish to turn the tide. In Erda, things had also changed. It was the reason Earl and Ariel had to return to Erda too. It was also why the other members of the Forest Circle would be traveling to different dimensions chosen as a possible new home in case both Earth and Erda managed to destroy themselves. In the Earth dimension, many people would be responsible for the destruction. In Erda, it was just one person doing all the damage. Suzanne couldn't see the future, but it wasn't hard to see the outcome for both dimensions unless something changed. That was why it had become so important to gather the members of the new team, the Stone Circle. Unknown to them, they had been under observation and protection for their entire Earth lives. Each one had a role to play in the salvation of the Earth realm. They were a Karass, a group of people with a mission together that they would need to remember. Most of them were born in the Earth realm. However, 3 members had been born in Erda and moved to Earth. They would eventually return to Erda, but first some things had to happen in the Earth realm. Knowing 2 worlds, 2 dimensions was difficult. But Suzanne's life had never been easy. She was much more than even her best friend knew. As Suzanne watched Earl prepare the room for the meeting, Suzanne's thoughts drifted back to when she was given a choice of what she would become. She wasn't sure if it was ever really a choice, But her mother had made her believe that it was. Perhaps that was the way of the world. Choose for yourself, or life will choose for you. Suzanne wasn't sure which one was the harder road to travel, but she had chosen what her mother had wanted her to choose, and that made all the difference. Abigail looked up from her work to see Suzanne leaning against the wall, staring into space. Something bothering you, Suzanne? You mean more than trying to get ready for this transition? More than that. And since once this happens, everything will be different. Perhaps now you will tell me more about what happened between you and your mother. I know you are more than appears on the surface. I couldn't have been your friend for this long without knowing there is more. Maybe this is the time you tell me the story. That way, I can carry that story with me and keep it safe. Suzanne looked at her friend and realized how much she wanted to tell just one other person about the choice that changed her life. What would Abigail think? Abigail answered Suzanne's thoughts. No matter what you tell me, it won't change how I feel about you, Suzanne. Forever and ever, you and I are connected. Suzanne paused 1 minute more and then made up her mind. Abigail was right. It was time. First, Suzanne stepped into the kitchen and made them each a cup of coffee. Perhaps this way it would feel less important and more like any other story. Suzanne drifted back to her time with her mother and began her story. Chapter 3. You have to make a choice. Which do you choose? That's the message I heard over and over again, Suzanne said. It was the last thing I heard before I went to bed at night. I dreamed about it. It was the first thing on my mind in the morning. During the day, while I pretended that nothing was going on, it pinged into my brain. Choose. Will you take on your destiny, or are you going to run away and pretend that life as only one thing is enough for you? That was the question. Run or stay and be two things. Live two lives. Who could choose something like that? Well, I had to, just as every shapeshifter has to decide. Abigail drew in a breath and Suzanne paused to look at her. So this is what you have been living with all this time? Abigail asked. Suzanne nodded. Is this too much? Shall I tell you the rest? Of course I want to hear. Throughout the years I have known you, you have shown me that we are all much more than what appears to the world, that we are not just our bodies. The fact that you are more than this human shape doesn't surprise me. It's exciting to discover that I have been friends with a shapeshifter all this time. I didn't even know that shapeshifters actually existed. I thought they were a myth. And yet, here you are. Now you have to tell me the rest of the story. Suzanne sighed and began again. Now that she had started this story, she had to finish it. That's it, you see. I didn't have to be a shapeshifter. I could have said no. That wasn't true many years ago, but now we have a choice. It was my mother who fought for us to have the right to choose. When she was young, shapeshifters didn't have a choice. They had to live as a shapeshifter, whether they liked it or not. My mother didn't think that was right. Just because we were born as a shapeshifter didn't mean we had to live as one. So she made sure that I and every other shapeshifter in Erda could decide for themselves. Be one or be two or even more versions of yourself if that was your nature. My mother was revered for fighting for that choice, but at times I didn't want it. My mother kept asking me to choose whether I would remain only as the person everyone knows as Suzanne or embrace my destiny and also become Lady the Dragon. Suzanne glanced over at her friend to see what her response was to what she had said. But Abigail nodded at her to go on, her eyes soft and understanding. It was one of the reasons they had become such deep friends. Abigail always understood. Suzanne took a deep breath and continued. My choice was more straightforward than some other shapeshifters because not every shapeshifter is only two things. These lucky or unlucky shapeshifters can become anything at all. The shape they keep the most is not necessarily their real self. The form most shapeshifters choose to show is the one that helps them fit in the best. These shapeshifters want to be part of their world and be comfortable in it. Sometimes shapeshifters hide what they can do, and their best friends have no idea that they are anything other than the person they know. Once again, Suzanne glanced at Abigail, who smiled and nodded at her to go on. If she was astonished at what she was hearing, it wasn't showing. Others never settled down into one or another shape, either because they are comfortable in multiple environments, or they love to stand out, be stared at, or be the hero or villain that everyone recognizes. But for shapeshifters like me, we are only two things, so the choice should be more comfortable, but it's not really. There is the problem of changing between forms. Well, let's just say that it's not pleasant. It probably looks effortless to someone looking on. One moment I will be a person, the next I will be a dragon. But those brief seconds of transition are always, always painful. Choose, Suzanne, my mother would say to me, and for years I turned away. I know that my indecision was painful for my mother and father to watch, but they stayed out of it and let me choose. I almost said no, and yet they still didn't step in. Maybe my parents always knew I would choose to live two lives and fulfill my destiny. They knew what that choice meant. Both my mother and father are the same as me, human and dragon. They knew what they were asking of me because they lived it. However, my mother believed in the freedom of choice. She thought that was a kinder way to go, to let me and all shapeshifters choose. But it didn't feel that way to me. Instead, I was a coward. I wanted someone to tell me what to do. Of course, that would mean I'd have an excuse to blame someone else. I suppose that is one reason my mother insisted that it was me that chose. I thought I made it easier for myself by purposefully and willfully ignoring her, the question, and the decision. But it didn't. Abigail nodded, not knowing what to say. Suzanne shook her head, sighed, and continued. On the other hand, my younger sister, Meg, had no problem choosing. Two recessive genes had met in her and made her into the shapeshifter who could be anything, and she loved it. Even when she was younger, Meg loved terrorizing all of us by hiding in a form that we didn't recognize. The three of us would panic. Where had she gone? Eventually, Meg had to let go of the shape, and there she would be, a human child laughing so hard tears would be running down her face. Punishment of any kind never worked. She would turn into something else and wait until everyone gave up trying to discipline her. In moments of quiet, Meg was a wonder. We shared secrets and told each other stories. But Meg was rarely quiet, and as much as I loved her as my sister, she frightened me as a shapeshifter. There were no long moments of indecision for her. The second she realized she could look like anything she wanted to be, Meg was often running, trying one shape after another. Her choice was to decide whether to use her abilities for good or what she would call mischievousness. By the time she was 6, she was a wild child, and it was because of Meg that I eventually chose to be both human and dragon. Her mischievousness finally turned into more than mischievousness, and my parents couldn't wait for me to make a decision any longer. They had their own choice to make, let their youngest daughter run wild or do their best to contain her. They hoped that as Meg grew older, she would gain empathy to match her abilities and her courage. I wanted to believe it was possible, but I didn't and don't hold the hope that my parents have for Meg. If my parents couldn't handle my sister, that left only two options, the option of sanction or death. All the shapeshifters in Erda would be able to vote to stop my sister in one of those ways. Even that wouldn't be easy. I prayed every day that it wouldn't be necessary. Finally, my parents decided that Meg couldn't stay in Erda. Instead of waiting until her death or her banishment, they took her away to another planet, one that would be hard for anyone to find, including me. They left me for her. Abigail reached over and held her friend's hand. Even though I know you must have rationalized why this was necessary, I know it still must be painful. Suzanne nodded. It is, and it is also one reason why I treasure Earl and Ariel, who have acted as my mother and father all these years. They saved me and helped me because with my parents' departure to look after Meg, the choice was essentially made for me after all. I would be both Suzanne and Lady. As Lady, I would replace my mother as the head of the crown of dragons that my parents had flown with. It also left me with my mother's other role, liaison between the Earth Realm and Erda. Abigail squeezed Suzanne's hand and said, I know, I only know you as Suzanne, but I am grateful you made that choice. You have shown us all the things we would have never learned on our own. And I know that you will take care of my granddaughter Hannah when the time comes for that, when she travels to her true destiny in Erda. Suzanne bowed her head and said, I will do my best. Chapter 4. As agreed, the brothers returned to check on the progress of the Earth and Erda dimension. They had been gone a long time, and much had changed. The beings they had released into Earth and Erda had mostly thrived. It seemed that their experiment was going well. Both dimensions had evolved as expected. In fact, the results were so predictable that on reviewing the progress, one of the brothers was upset. The last few thousand years of travel had not gone well for Brother 2. Perhaps if the brothers had stayed on Gaia when they had first arrived, he would not have become the bitter and angry person he now was. Brother 1, on the other hand, had mellowed and was tired of it all. He was especially tired of his brother. He and his brother had been arguing almost daily, and 1 was getting sick of it. So when 2 said he wanted to speed up the experiment between the Earth and Erda dimension, 1 was ready to agree. Anything to make his life a little more peaceful. During their travels and researching of the experiments, they had discovered something that bothered 2 and delighted 1. You would think it would have been the other way around, though, since he had started out as the more rational and determined of the 2 of them. He is the one who had suggested the experiments, and it was usually 1 that designed the parameters of the tests. 1 thought that he would be able to live with the result of those experiments. But as time passed, he became more and more uncomfortable at what he had done. Too many of the tests they designed had turned into disasters. Entire planets were gone. Others were in the last stages of destruction. Only a few had survived, and even fewer had thrived. Brother 1 wanted to know what was making the difference. What was the defining factor? Over time, 1 had discovered why some planets managed to thrive, and it was that discovery that had changed him. He now wanted to stop the destruction, and he believed he knew how to do it. But 2 opposed him. It was what they fought over every day. Now, as they once again stood on Gaia, they were at a crossroads. The planet was still beautiful, but not as pristine as when they had first found it. 1 feared that both dimensions were fighting a losing battle, and in time, they would self-destruct. This was no longer the outcome 1 wanted. He was a tired brother now. He was finished with experiments. He wanted to either stay on Gaia or find another planet where he could stay and live out his life. Yes, Brother 1 was ready to stop, but Brother 2 had changed too. He was no longer happy even in his boredom. Now he was angry, very angry, and he wanted to continue experimenting to appease his anger. Truth be told, what he wanted to do was see more planets destroyed. Something had taken over, too. Every day he found more and more joy in producing chaos and destruction. Nothing seemed to satisfy him, and his older brother was at his wits' end as to what to do with him and how to stop him. As they stood on Gaia, they came up with what would be their final experiment. So far, their testing had not been discovered by their own people, but sooner or later they would be. The brothers knew that they were breaking the law with their tests. When their people found them, they would stop them. Neither brother knew what they would do to them, but neither of them wanted to find out. Since they both knew there was only so much time left, Brother 2 had a suggestion for their final experiment. This time, he would stay on Gaia and carry the test out himself. In the meantime, one would travel to planets that hadn't destroyed themselves yet and see if he could reverse the results of their experiments using what he had discovered. When one returned to Gaia, they would determine the winner. Brother 1 hoped that Erda would still be there when he came back, because his brother's plan was so irrational, it might work. He feared for his brother's sanity. He was getting worse by the day. Brother 2 firmly believed that evil would always win. More than that, since 2 wanted evil to win, he was going to help it along. They both knew that there was someone in place who would lead the way to fight against 2's evil intent. Brother 2 said he would defeat her. Brother 1 prayed that 2 was wrong. They both knew that her travels between the dimensions of Earth and Erda would shape the outcome of both dimensions. Brother 1 hoped that the girl named Hannah would remember who she was in time, and that the team that gathered around her would help her discover the secret to defeating his brother. As Brother 1's silver, snake-shaped spaceship lifted away, leaving his brother behind in Erda, he watched the blue dot drift out of sight, knowing that he might not ever see it look this beautiful again. He had made a bargain with the devil. He hoped it had been the right thing to do. Now the outcome of both dimensions and the future of the planet Gaia was out of his hands and into the hands of the good people of both Earth and Erda. The end. The Experiment, written by Becca Lewis, copyright 2019. Audio by Becca Lewis, copyright 2020.